Welcome to the HR Quick Take with Brad and Sandy, or if you prefer, welcome to HR Office Hours with Brad and Sandy. I'm Brad deBeaubien, an employment law attorney and partner at Shoemaker in Tampa.
And I am Sandy Zannino. I am an HR and DEI practitioner, specialist, and I am right down the road from Brad in Sarasota, is where I'm located.
Nice. We're coming to you today with a special Valentine's Day edition. Sandy, I read recently, and I have no reason to dispute this, given that we spend roughly 2,000 hours a year at work with our colleagues, right? 40 hours a week times, call it 50 weeks a year. It's no surprise, it should come as no surprise to us that the occasional romance blooms, right? That's a lot of time together. It's more time than we spend with the other people in our lives. At least it's more waking hours than most of us spend with the other people in our lives. So when love is in the air, does that necessarily mean trouble in the workplace? What are your thoughts?
Romance, and I think it can be trouble, but you can't stop these things, right? Like that's how I feel about it. I know I've worked with some employers who want to have a very, very hard line, right? And I think that that's a mistake, because it encourages people to hide things.
Yep.
Because, like you said, we spend the majority of our time with the people that we work, and inevitably something is going to happen. I think the trouble really can happen when there's supervisor and subordinate, right? Like that's the challenge, right? I mean,
100%. Let's talk a little bit about some of the risks I think that come up with workplace romances, and I'm curious whether you've counseled anybody on any of these things. But I think there's kind of a few big things that present as problems when we have workplace romances, and you're 100% right. I think a hard line that says we're going to prohibit them is unworkable. It is unrealistic, and so for most employers, finding a way to navigate those is better. And we'll talk a little bit maybe about that as we wrap up here. But what are some of the risks that we see? I'll kick us off. I think one, you of course have there's, particularly if you have subordinate and supervisor relationships, is there's going to be that perceived favoritism, right? That the person who's in the romantic relationship with the supervisor is getting preferential or better treatment than other employees. And the lawyer in me goes, well, how can I frame that as a legal claim? I suppose the person who feels like they're not getting that advantage would claim some sort of discrimination on the basis of gender or the fact that they're not in this relationship. I don't know how strong of a claim that is, but at the very least, putting that aside, you've got a logistical problem, right? You've got a practical problem, which is you have unhappy workers.
Right.
So that perceived favoritism, if we've got a supervisor subordinate relationship in particular, I think is a problem. Any other kind of things that are maybe on your list, Sandy? I got a couple others on mine.
Right along those lines, I just read recently about a case where the subordinate was female, and what the supervisor said was, well, if we're going to have this relationship, you've got to quit. Like, you can't work here anymore.
Yeah.
And she said, I don't want to do that.
Yeah.
So
already my alarm bells for the employer are going off, right? That the supervisor's taking it upon themselves to have this conversation and sort of speak and put this, all these discrimination and improper treatment claims are going off in my head. So sorry to cut you off.
No, it's true. Like that, Brad, that's what I love about our conversations, right? Like every time we talk, we're aligned, right? I think. And I think that there's the challenges, also challenges when there's the breakup.
Oh yeah.
Sometimes, I mean, of course, no relationship starts out where you want it to be a breakup, but sometimes it is. That has to be navigated. Probably a good reason to let management and HR know that
Yep.
there is a relationship. That's the kind of policy I kind of prefer. Like, okay, like if it's going to happen, you need to
Let me hit you with a couple other things that I think present as potential problems when you have romance in the workplace. Potential conflicts of interest, right? This is kind of part and parcel of that favoritism, right? If you've got a person who's in a romantic relationship, are they doing anything that favors that person that they're in a relationship with or members of their team. And then this sort of dovetails, we'll talk a little bit about policies, right? But you typically have an anti-nepotism policy, or a lot of companies do, right? Which says, hey, we won't hire immediate family members of people, right? Because of concerns about these kinds of preferential treatments. And then oftentimes you'll see companies sort of have an anti-romance policy or a mandatory disclosure of romance policy anyway, that kind of travels along those same lines. And so you've got anti-nepotism policies, which for a long time in companies said, we're just going to absolutely prohibit the hiring of relatives. Now, kind of like we were talking about with these relationships, they're tolerant of them. They require disclosure and, put some guardrails and protections around them rather than an outright prohibition on either the hiring of family members or the, existence of these romantic relationships. Sharing confidential company information, right, is another concern you have, right? If the person's in an intimate relationship, maybe one of them has access to knowledge or information about the company that the other person wouldn't otherwise have. But, pillow talk being what it is, maybe, some things get shared that shouldn't be, maybe even to a person who doesn't have a confidentiality agreement or some other protection in place that would limit their ability to have access to that information or what they could do with it. And then kind of the big one, I told you recently, I love to read the, in the course of reading the news, I'm always drawn to articles that are human resources related or employment related generally. And so the New York Times had an article this past week about the top 25 tweets of all time, in their opinion. And Sandy, can you guess what the most important tweet? I think it was the most important tweets of all time. You want to guess what they had the #1 most important tweet of all time as?
No, I have zero idea.
I'll give you a hint. It was posted by Alyssa Milano.
Oh, hashtag me too.
Me too. Yeah. Honestly, it gave me chills when I read that. How, just how impactful, seeing that tweet in its original verbiage and like knowing what it launched and created, right, was just tremendous. And so, that brings me to my point about sexual harassment and the potential for sexual harassment claims as, a byproduct of romance in the workplace. Just obviously a huge problem area for employers. And so something that we want to, be mindful of as we try and, implement some protections or guardrails, as you say, about navigating these things.
And, Brad, on the ground, right, employers, I talk to a lot of employers, and one thing that is definitely, I've had conversations, maybe at least 3 that I know, with business owners who are trying to figure out what to do when a romance has bloomed and one of their employees is married.
No.
Right? So you know what I mean? Like
that's a whole other ball of wax. Yeah.
It is a whole other ball of wax, right? And they don't know what to do about how to navigate this. One, the spouse who was not employed was like, hey, you were letting this happen. You're helping wreck my marriage, right? Like, where's the employer's responsibility begin and end in that? How do you navigate that morally versus legally?
Sure.
You have any
and those are maybe 2 different, it's an interesting point, and we run up against it, from time to time, in both of our respective works is, well, maybe the moral piece looks a little different than what's strictly required under the law. I would say generally under the legal side, we don't necessarily owe any duty to the spouse that doesn't really work for the employer, but it certainly raises a whole host of thorny issues, for employers, and something that, typically want to talk to your HR person or counsel about how to navigate.
Yeah, it can, sometimes the stories on the ground that maybe aren't necessarily exactly right. So we could write a book. HR professionals for sure could write a book with what this happened in the workplace. Yep. Liaisons and closets. One, I'll tell you off screen, and then we'll see if we want to add it in. It's so like, it has to do with self-love.
Oh my. HR is never a dull moment, is there? Yeah.
Never, ever, ever a dull moment, but figuring out how to navigate those things that happen, right? It's all part of it, especially when love is in the air, right? Here we are on Valentine's
Indeed.
Day. And also learning how to celebrate people too, right?
True.
Balance.
That's
Because
part of it. We had a wedding in our office in the not too distant past of two folks in our office. So
yeah, I was just gonna say the same thing. I know a couple that they've been married now over 20 years, and
yeah,
they met at work. They met at the workplace, so um it's a balance. It is definitely a balance. And we just
indeed. All right. Well, let's talk briefly about what those policies ought to look like. And I have kind of two things in mind that I wanted to maybe touch on. The first was sort of just a general policy on workplace romances, and then the second, which is I think sort of a different order of magnitude, is the proverbial love contract. And I don't know if that's a term that you use or are familiar with.
oh, that's new to me, but I'm curious. I want to know.
Sure. Well, I'll tell you about what that looks like. So first of all, though, just a policy on workplace romances, right? I think, kind of like I alluded to with an anti-nepotism policy, right? We've both said it's hard to just put an outright prohibition on workplace romances and maybe unworkable. And if you have one, it may just be a breeding ground for people to do things covertly and behind your back because they feel like, it's gonna happen. And so trying to prohibit it outright is maybe just not workable. Would you tend to agree with that?
I completely agree with that.
So with respect to the policy, generally, what do we want to ask for? We want to, basically just require disclosure of the relationship, and I think the one prohibition we want to put in place, though, is that supervisor subordinate, right? A direct reporting relationship, or anybody that's in sort of the reporting line. It's just that creates too many problems, and I think that is a place where it's okay to say, look, we just can't have this. Now, that doesn't mean that the company can't consider reassigning people to help accommodate, a blooming relationship. But we simply can't, for the most part, have people in a direct report, or even in sort of the same reporting line. I think in a romantic relationship, it just raises too many.
There's too much opportunity for liability, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And in connection with the policy, I think generally reminding folks about the expectation of professional conduct. I've seen some that, if the company doesn't have a PDA or public displays of affection policy, sort of incorporates it into their workplace romance policy, meaning we don't want, anyone making out in the break room kind of thing. So we want to require disclosure of the relationship to HR. We want to ban the relationships between supervisors and subordinates, and then just sort of